Morning, guys. Welcome back to today's lesson. I hope you're all well. As always, before we get started, please make sure that you have all of your equipment ready and anything that you are going to be writing on for today's lesson. Pause the video now and make sure you're prepared. Okay, if you're back, that means you are ready to write down our title, our date, and our LO, which is I will read chapter 24 so I can understand how the novel ends. Pause the video now and get these three things written down. Okay, if you're back, that means you are ready to complete our do now. You need to make sure you answer these 5 questions in full sentences. Who is arrested in chapter 22? Who causes Bill to find and kill Nancy? Why is Nancy actually not a traitor? Write 3 adjectives to describe Bill when he tries to escape. How does Bill die? Pause the video now and answer these 5 questions in full sentences. Alright, if you're back, that means you are ready to make some purple pen corrections. As always, give it a tick if you got it right, cross it if you got it wrong, and if you did get it wrong, that's okay. Just make sure you make the correct answer now. So, the Artful Dodger is arrested in chapter 22. Monks causes Bill to find and kill Nancy because he tells Bill that Nancy has gone to Mr. Brownlow. Nancy is actually not a traitor and she doesn't go to the police. You could use 3 of these adjectives: desperate, panicked, worried, concerned, frantic. You might have some different ones of your own. If you're not sure if they're right, I can double check those when you submit your work. And finally, Bill falls off a building when he tries to jump across. Pause the video now and make any corrections that you need to. Alright, so before we get into the final chapter of the novel, which is very exciting, I really want to figure out what you guys think is going to happen. So I want you to write a prediction about the end of the novel using this sentence starter. I think that the novel will end with. Do you think anyone's going to get arrested? What do you think is going to happen to Oliver? Pause the video now and use this sentence starter to make a prediction. Okay, if you're back, that means you've written your prediction. So let's look at a summary of chapter 24. Mr. Brownlow visits Oliver to explain about recent events. Monks appears, which startles Oliver, and Mr. Brownlow continues to explain about Oliver's life and his family. I haven't included too much in the summary today because I don't want to spoil it for you before we start reading. Alright, so let's read chapter 24 together. As we read, can you think about how does Oliver's luck change? We talk quite a lot about how Oliver goes up and he's happy, and then he goes down and he's sad, and he goes up and down and up and down. So at the end of the novel, how does Oliver's luck finally change? Okay, let's start reading. I'm going to be using this red laser to indicate what line we are going to be reading. So hopefully you won't get too stuck. All right, let's go. Chapter 24, A New Family. Several weeks of quiet living passed. Life at Mrs. Maylie seemed remarkably calm after so much excitement. It was a bright summer's day when Oliver was called in from the garden. Rose said that there was someone there to see him. Oliver jumped for joy when he saw Mr. Brownlow in the sitting room. He hugged the gentleman with all his might. "Oliver," Mr. Brownlow said, "it's wonderful to see you. I'm glad to see you safe in capable hands." "It's wonderful here," Oliver said. "Everyone is kind and wonderful. It's just like living with you and Mrs. Bedwin." Brownlow laughed and ruffled the boy's hair. "You're a lucky boy to have so many homes." especially when I had none for so many years, Oliver replied. I've come with some very important news. I'm sure you will all want to hear it, Mr. Brownlow said. First of all, I've heard from the police. Fagin has been sentenced to many years of hard labour. I think we can all relax on that front. Just pause for a second. If Fagin has been sentenced, what has he been caught for doing? And you should be thinking about the fact that Fagin has been caught by the police for all of his criminal activities. Let's carry on. It looks like you have nothing to worry about, Oliver, Harry said. He touched the young boy on the shoulder. No Bill Sikes or Fagin to cause any more trouble. It is a shame about Nancy, though. Everyone in the room nodded sadly. Oliver looked like he might cry. Mr. Brownlow took a deep breath. He asked everyone to take a seat. Now, would you please excuse me for a moment? Brownlow walked into the hall. After a moment, he returned with another man. It was none other than Monks. Oliver was horrified. He jumped from his seat and ran to stand beside Harry's seat. Don't worry, Oliver, Brownlow said. Monks cannot hurt you now. As a matter of fact, he is here to help. Monks nodded slowly. My word, Mrs. Maylie said. Whatever could this mean? Oliver, Mr. Brownlow said, please come and sit by me. You are the centre of this story. It has all come out because you were brave enough to come to London. Brownlow looked to Monks. Shall I start the story? Monks nodded, once again, but remained silent. He looked tired and ashamed. Do you remember the painting of the woman above my fireplace? Brownlow asked Oliver. The boy nodded. I noticed that painting too, Harry piped up. It was very striking. It was given to me by my oldest and dearest friend before he left on a long trip. He was going to Paris to settle his finances. His ex-wife and son lived there. My friend had fallen in love again and wanted to remarry. The painting is of Agnes, the young woman that he loved. He asked me to keep it until he returned. Unfortunately, I received word several weeks later that my friend had died while abroad. Oh, how awful! Rose exclaimed. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Rose, Mr. Brownlow said. That's very kind of you. Brownlow took something from his pocket. Now, Oliver, would you be so kind as to look inside the locket? Oliver opened up the locket. He let out a gasp when he saw the inside. Mr. Brownlow, he said, it's the same woman from the painting. Yes, my boy, Mr. Brownlow closed Oliver's hand around the locket. This locket belongs to you. Me? Oliver was taken aback. Why would you give it to me? It is your mother who wanted you to have it, Brownlow said. She gave it to you shortly before she died, but greedy persons at the workhouse kept it from you. You see, Oliver, I noticed your similarity to the painting right away. I contacted Mr. and Mrs. Bumble at the workhouse seeking more information. They came to see me, looking for money, of course, and delivered this locket. My mother? Oliver said. The boy was in shock. This is an amazing story, Rose exclaimed. She hugged Oliver. I'm so happy for you, Oliver. You found your family. There's more to this story, Rose, Brownlow said, and I think you'll find it of particular interest, he said to her. Me? Rose said, sitting back down. I think it's time that we bring our guests into the story, Brownlow said. Oliver, you know this gentleman by the name of Monks, but his name is actually Leaford. He is the son of my dear friend, Edward Leaford. Then, does that mean? Mrs. Maylie spoke slowly. Yes, Monks said. Oliver is my half-brother. He sighed and looked around the room. My father arrived in Paris to discuss his will with my mother. He wanted to ensure that Agnes and their unborn child were taken care of in case anything happened. My father died before any papers were drawn up. Since my mother and I were still his legal heirs, we were the first to go through his belongings. We hid my father's wishes from the lawyers. We told no one about Agnes or the child. My mother was outraged. She did not want to part with any of my father's money. She was obsessed, and so was I. That's awful, Mrs. Maylie said. How could she do such a thing? I'm just as guilty, madam, Monk said. I was greedy and did not want to share my father's money. It didn't end there, though. We were both afraid of discovery. I'm afraid to say that I was nearly driven mad by the secrecy. Everyone in the room sat quietly while Monk spoke. Oliver sat next to Rose on the couch. Her arm was draped over his shoulder. We knew enough about Agnes to track her down, Monk continued. We discovered her father and younger sister living in the family home. Agnes had disappeared a few months earlier. I searched through the records of many towns and workhouses until I discovered the death of the young woman. She was Agnes's age and had given birth to a boy. The boy was still living in the workhouse. He had been given the name Oliver Twist. We were worried that Agnes's family would make the same discovery. Her father, however, had grown sick with worry. He had moved to a seaside town with his young daughter and lived a life of isolation. He died in his small cottage, leaving the girl with no known relatives. My mother and I had hoped that all our problems were solved. The young girl was left with a widow. We assumed that she would be sent to an orphanage. The widow, however, considered her family and raised her as her niece. Who is this? Who is this widow? And who is this niece? Have you figured it out yet? Let's carry on reading to find out. Rose looked to Mrs. Maylie, then Harry, then Mr. Brownlow. She was speechless. Am I to understand, Mrs. Maylie said, that Rose was that girl? Yes, Monk said. I've been watching your family, from a distance of course, for many years now. Rose is the younger sister of Agnes. I can't quite believe this, Rose said. Harry hugged her. Oliver looked up at her. That makes you my aunt. Oliver hugged Rose once more. This time, however, he thought he might never let go. And that, Mr. Brownlow said, is the end of the story. He ruffled Oliver's hair. That's funny, Harry laughed. It feels like the beginning to me. He watched Rose and Oliver embrace. Rose smiled back at him. Oh, Mr. Brownlow, Mrs. Maylie said, we can't thank you enough. I think this means our Rose will finally agree to marry Harry. The room was filled with laughter and tears. The only one who looked uncomfortable was Monks. He felt guilt and shame about his actions. Mr. Brownlow had agreed to not press charges. Monks agreed to give Oliver his share of the inheritance. Just pause for a second. I wanted to explain this. This means that because Monks and Oliver share the same father, the money that their father left, it needs to be split between Monks and Oliver. And Monks has kept it for so many years, but he's now going to give Oliver some money. Let's carry on. So this is where we leave our young hero. Fear not, though. Oliver Twist lived a warm and happy life from that point on. Harry and Rose were married. Mrs. Maylie and Oliver continued to live with them in the sweet little house with a garden. Mr. Brownlow visited often. At long last, Oliver had a family. His life was filled with more people and more love than he ever could have imagined. Guys, did we predict that this was going to happen? Did you have any idea at all that this was going to happen? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. All right. Now, let's do this final task for today's lesson. I would want you to complete these sentence starters below. Monks has always been interested in Oliver because you need to write a reason. Oliver is related to Rose because you need to explain how Rose is Oliver's aunt. At most points in the novel, Dickens presents Oliver as helpless and poor because. At the end of the novel, Dickens presents Oliver as content and lucky because. 3 adjectives to describe Mr. Brownlow are. Okay, pause the video now, complete these sentence starters, and then come back. Alright guys, if you're back, that means that these 5 sentence starters have been completed. So now what you need to do is, as always, take a picture of your work and send it to me by email. My email is always listed on Show My Homework. Excellent work today, guys, and I will see you in tomorrow's video.